attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, good day, good afternoon, everybody. This is IAP2, and welcome to our December webinar, Meeting Disruptions and How to Handle Them. My name is Drew Snyder. I'll be your technical producer for this, and in just a moment I'll introduce Larry Schooler, who in turn will introduce our special presenter for today. Let me just start off by giving you a few technical notes about this. There are a whole lot of you on this line, and I have muted. We have control over your microphones, so everybody's mic is muted right now. Has to be muted because otherwise you get some really nasty feedback and echo effects that go along there, which can be really distracting. So everybody is muted right now. If you've got your phone or your microphone muted, please take it off mute and let us control it from here. When we get to our question and answer period, or if you have a question or a comment you want to make on the fly, you'll see a little hand icon beside your name. Click that, and that will indicate that you want to say something, you want to ask a question. We'll also be tossing out a poll question. We've got 3 poll questions, and during the time our presenter, Michaelson, will ask us to send out the poll question. Take a moment, think about it, and then vote. And it will give us an idea of, well, it's a good way of being involved, being engaged in this discussion on engagement. So we'll have those questions coming up to you throughout the webinar. So we'll have our presentation from Lewis, and then we'll have a question and answer session and a chance for people to chat and to discuss what's been going on and share some of your own experiences in this too. So with that, I think I've pretty much covered all this. This is being recorded, and the recording will be available on the IAP2 Canada and IAP2 USA websites within 48 hours. So give us that time to get it posted, and you'll be able to review this for your own personal professional development as you see fit. So with all that, I'm going to toss this over to the president of IAP2 USA, Mr. Larry Schooler. Larry?
Well, thank you very much, Drew. And I wonder if anybody else feels like they're live on the radio with that silky smooth voice that Drew has there.
I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about, Larry.
As a former radio man myself, I'm very impressed with the silky smooth tones that Drew bangs. I'm also very impressed with our turnout today. It's great to see so many people interested in this topic, and we appreciate the members who suggested this topic on our crowdsourcing page and those who supported it. It's important to us that we make sure that our webinars are responding to the needs that you all have as you do your work in this important field. And like I said, we're glad that this topic bubbled up as one that would be important to you. Drew, actually, I'm wondering, before I introduce Lewis, if it'd be possible for us to go through a couple of these poll questions, just because I think it'd be helpful to Lewis to see to see more of what the audience's perspective on this topic might be. So do you know if we could go to polls here at the beginning?
Yeah, we got a few of these questions, and one thing I'm not sure is if we can bring all of them up for people to see, so I'll read them off to you. One of them is a multiple choice.
It looks like I can launch. Let me see what happens. Can I launch this poll?
You can launch one of them.
Okay. Can folks see that? I'm assuming so.
How often do you experience?
Yes.
Yeah, here we go. And here's a whole lot of votes coming in right now.
Yeah, so our question is, how often do you experience the disruptions that we're talking about today when you facilitate public meetings? Never, seldom, occasionally, often, or regularly. And we're getting good results right now, so let me just pause for a couple of seconds.
I notice never has got a flat 0 right now, so everybody has had to deal with disruptions at some point in time.
That's right. Yeah, it looks like most people deal with it either occasionally or often. Occasionally is the highest vote-getting response. So I'll wait for just maybe 10 more seconds, and then we'll move on to the next poll. I think when I close it, you'll be able to see the result. But we've got 55% saying occasionally and 27% often, with another 7% saying this is something they deal with regularly. Let me then shift to another question trying to get a little bit more detail on the kinds of disruptions that you find yourself experiencing most often, or that you feel like you need the most help addressing. So, sometimes I deal, and even last night dealt with just, mild-mannered, normally expressed, but off-topic comments or speeches. Sometimes you get shouted comments. Other times you get people holding up signs or doing something else non-verbally. And other times you get multiple people sort of lashing out all at once. So the question is, which of these do you deal with on a more regular basis? So it looks as if I'm actually in the majority on this one, that a number of 80% or more of folks say that the mild-mannered off-topic comments are ones that trip them up the most, or that they need the most help addressing, with another 45% getting shouted comments, 16% nonverbal, 28% getting multiple verbal disruptions at once, and 7% with some sort of other. If you have a specific other kind of disruption that you want to share with Lewis or with the group, feel free to use the chat window to get that across, so we can be sure to try to cover it. And then let me just hit one other question that Lewis was particularly interested in, as to whether the disruptions seem to be organized and pre-planned or more spontaneous, based on just reactions to what's happening during the meeting. So that last poll question is up, just a two-choice answer. And looks like about a third or more of our respondents see these kinds of organized and pre-planned disruptions, Lewis. So very interesting data point there, now closer to 40%, with the remaining voters saying that they tend to be spontaneous. It's just so interesting. There must be, I think, some degree of regional variety in this, because I tend to see more of the spontaneous, and I know that Lewis is based in California, and we have members all over the continent on the call today, so I wonder if it's different geographically. So about 59% saying spontaneous, and 41% saying it appears to be organized and pre-planned. So an interesting mix. Thank you all very much for participating in that. It's just helpful when we get people participating right off the bat and give the presenter a sense of where we're headed. So I'm very honored to present to you today a mentor of mine and someone who is a undisputed leader in our field and in our organization, Lewis Michaelson, who works for a firm called Katz & Associates and leads efforts in the San Diego office. He's a facilitator, mediator, and environmental dispute resolution specialist with nearly 30 years of experience in designing and facilitating consensus-building programs for environmental planning and impact analysis projects. He's worked on all kinds of issues, including transportation planning, energy production and transmission, wastewater and stormwater projects, airports, regional water supply, hazardous waste cleanup, watershed planning, military base closures, and land use management. Lewis was a past president of IAP2, instrumental in spearheading the development of our core values and our code of ethics, and one of the 3 original developers of the incredibly well-respected and famous Foundations of Public Participation training courses. And Lewis holds a bachelor's in sociology and a master's degree, like mine, in conflict management. So, Mr. Lewis Michaelson of San Diego, welcome to IAP2's North American webinar for this month. Thank you, as always, for your incredible dedication to our field and to our organization, and we're excited to hear your presentation.
Thanks very much, Larry. Appreciate it. You know, the polling results didn't surprise me a lot, particularly the fact that virtually everyone, it seemed, had experienced some level of meeting disruption. If you participate in meetings, it's pretty much synonymous with disruptions. It's just the nature of democracy. It's a messy process for the most part. It's a good process, but messy. And I always like to, I'm going to put up a presentation here that similar to one I adapted it. I keep getting feedback from doing this presentation, so I keep revising it slightly to try and capture even more of what is not just my experience, but the collective wisdom of other people who have dealt with these situations. But I always feel it's a good idea to start with a definition, because meetings disruptions to me are not all bad. Just like if you do conflict management, you know, conflict can have positive results. And I know in addition to the meeting disruption piece, some people who had suggested this topic had indicated that, that there was also a conflict management element to it that they were hoping to. So we'll try and get into that. I have very few slides, and I'm hoping that we can have some discussion as we go along and not just listen to me the whole time. But in any case, you can see the title, Meeting Disruptions, Challenges and Opportunities, because like I said, it's not all bad. Sometimes you know, the energy in the room is not what you expected it to be. It has a different tone or direction, and the question is, are we going to fight that energy, or are we going to try and channel that energy? So it presents both challenges and opportunities. So as a facilitator, that's what I'm trained to do, is to recognize what's in the room and what's possible to do in the room at that point in time, where we are on the planet and where we are in the year and the day and the time of the day. What you planned may not be what happens in that meeting. But I've developed a typology and a way of developing strategies for responding to disruptions I'd like to just talk to you about today. But let's at least start with a definition, because everyone was answering those poll questions, but we're probably working with different ideas about what we meant by disruption. What I'm going to use for the purposes of this is that define it as any attempt by a participant or audience members to redirect the format or content of a meeting as originally planned or intended. And there's a difference between trying to redirect the format and the content. Sometimes they want to do both. Sometimes they really only want to do one. And the response to each one of those is slightly different. But in any case, it's an attempt by someone to redirect from what we originally planned. So the question is, what do we do when someone wants to redirect? And that question of whether it's spontaneous or pre-planned has a lot to do with what kinds of strategies will or won't work. There's basically 2 points in a meeting from a disruption standpoint, and that's before the meeting occurs and while the meeting is in progress. And because a lot of the meetings that I deal with are high profile, are anticipated to be controversial, we know that there are people who are opposed perhaps to, if not the proceedings, at least what might potentially be at stake in terms of a decision that may come out of that meeting. And oftentimes we gather intelligence ahead of time that tells us that people may be planning an organized disruption of sorts. And so some of the strategies that we've used successfully, I might say in many cases, is first anticipation, have an idea about what might be coming so that you've got some contingency plans and strategies in place. So that's kind of an internal piece. But there's also education. I've had success contacting people who are organizing planned demonstrations, disruptions, interventions, call them whatever you will, and helping them understand what the purpose of the meeting is, what the content, what will or won't happen as a result of the meeting, etc. And oftentimes they find out that this wasn't really what they thought it was, and it wasn't really the thing that they needed or wanted to, let's say, protest or disrupt. And so oftentimes they've decided that maybe that wasn't such a great plan on their part after all, or at least there's something that they may modify, or we can find a way to accommodate their needs and our needs. Oftentimes it means finding an alternative location or a separate room or something where they can set up a table or they can hand out their literature or whatever. So we find a way before the meeting starts to accommodate whatever their needs are, whatever their desires are, that don't interfere with what we were planning on doing. We've been successful with that a lot of times. You may get into a negotiation where kind of there has to be some give and take on what you're willing to put up with or adapt to and maybe bend a little bit on what you were planning on doing, but it still meets your needs, gets your purposes and objectives met. And then sometimes none of those things work, and basically there's what I call capitulation, which is simply you wanted to do meeting A and they've got a completely different meeting in mind, And it might be the format, it might be the content, it might be who they would like to be there to answer questions, etc. And we just say, you know what, we're never going to have the meeting we intended to have, but we may gain some credibility or some trust by letting them have the meeting that they wanted to have. And so we essentially, I know it's kind of a strong word, capitulation, but it's basically giving up for a time on what our intended perhaps content was in exchange for gaining maybe some relationship or trust value. And then there's just cancellation. There have been times, very, very few times, but a few times where the feeling was there really was nothing that was going to be accomplished positively for anybody by holding the meeting. The organizers have made it clear that pretty much they're going to shut it down unless we forcibly prevent them from doing it. And so we cancel a meeting and we regroup and we figure out some other way to get our needs met. So I'm going to see if we can open it up or not. Drew, the best that we can. I'd just like to hear from some people who've had some experience, perhaps good or bad or otherwise, with trying to use some of these strategies before a meeting to help minimize the impacts of a disruption.
What was that? Maybe I missed what you were trying to do there. Were you asking for, oh, I guess we've got some folks raising their hands.
Yes, can you call on them?
Yes, I can. Let's see. Why don't I start with my, let's see. I guess let's see. Ann Carroll, are you there? I think I've just unmuted you.
Yes, I am. Thank you, Larry.
Great.
Hi, Ann.
So, Louis, I actually will be at a meeting tonight that I'm not running, but my work is included in the major presentation for a decision at a city council.
Are you planning on
just
disrupting
recently,
it? Are you the organizer of the disruption, Ann?
No, I'm not. Would be interesting. It's been tempting, but I'm not.
Okay.
In this particular case, we've done a very robust and thoughtful and transparent public engagement process, but we have a group of people who haven't gotten their way completely. Actually, they've had significant appropriate influence, but they haven't gotten everything they wanted, and they're using their power and privilege, including a number of them being attorneys, to submit a rather threatening petition to the city council saying we want our way or else. And they intend to be at the public hearing, which is, of course, the worst possible way to do anything, but it's a legal requirement in this case, and be extremely disruptive. And I would be interested in some helpful thinking, but because we all are experiencing this kind of thing, how we might be able to be useful in this situation.
Sure. Well, first of all, there's not one size fits. So here's a case where it may or may not work, but in a case like that where the intentions have been announced, I'd be very tempted to contact one or more of the leaders and find out what it is that they're hoping to achieve, and finding out if there's a way for us to still hold our, legally required meeting and get the comments that we're required to get and on the record, and a way to still meet their needs. Is there a way that they could demonstrate out ahead of time, or could I set up a separate area where they're free to collect signatures to their petition without it having to interfere? I look for a way to accommodate their needs and still meet my public hearing process needs at the same time. If they're amenable, they're not. I mean, it's always voluntary, but I would look for a way that they can meet their needs and we can still meet our needs at the same time. Now, the format does make a difference, and we'll get into this in one of the later, I think in one of the later slides, is that you have different things that you can use as strategies to maintain order or stick to your intended agenda, depending upon whether it, in fact, is a required meeting or not a required meeting. But, it may be too late now simply because of meetings tonight, but even with people who say they're intending to disrupt a meeting, we've been reasonably successful in talking to them ahead of time and finding out some way for them to get, whether it's the notoriety, their faces on the TV, newscast. I mean, it's really kind of interesting what they want out of it. Sometimes they just want to make sure that they get publicizing of what they're doing, And so we arrange for an appropriate time for them to get their mugs in front of the TV camera, and they're good to go, and then they let us hold our meetings. So, but if you don't talk to them ahead of time, there's no chance to do that. And so anyway, that would be my quick response on that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ann.
Yeah, let's take one more. We'll just
Steve Buckley has his hand raised. Steve?
Yes, thank you, Larry. Can you hear me?
Yes, very much so.
Okay, great. Yes, Louis, the idea of being adaptable to an alternate format, if that's what I wanted to ask you about. We've been having something in my local town where the city council people have gotten up to talk about a particular issue when it was on topic, but then realized it was the wrong format. And I guess maybe having something in your pocket. What's been frustrating people is that the chair of the council will say, "Now's not the time. Now's not the time." Yes, the right topic, but we're not going to talk about the pros and cons of issue X now. That's for later. But then later never comes. So perhaps the idea of having a ready things that we'll talk about. If enough people get up and say that that their expectation for today's meeting was something else, then we'll have that on December 17th.
Yeah. I mean, you gave the magic words, and then it never happens. That's the problem. I mean, you've got to have a viable alternative, and then you have to follow through on that alternative. And oftentimes that will work, but only if you follow through. If they learn that it's a gambit to just get you to shut up, so they can get on, and then that's the end of it. We have a phenomenon. I know we have this is a North American, and we have a lot of Canadians on board today, so I'm not going to spend any time on it per se, or make it a part of the formal part of the presentation. But we have a phenomenon in the U.S. that's kind of running rampant, called the Anti-Agenda 21, being sponsored by the Tea Party. And they train people in how to overcome tricks like that. They consider facilitators the handmaidens of the devil, and that we know how to control people and control their thoughts. And so they'll fight every dishonest attempt at silencing them that you can imagine. None of those things. So it has to be real. It has to be not a fake alternative, but a real alternative. If it's a real alternative, it can work. Actually, what you're getting into really rolls, fortunately, right into some of the next couple of slides. So I'm going to roll into them because that situation we're going to talk about here. Thanks for the question.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah. So here's something that I think probably makes disruptions during a meeting the most difficult. And that is, it requires really rapid assessment in real time. And when I'm in these kinds of situations as a facilitator, I may have 30 to 60 seconds to figure out what I'm going to do and what's going to work before I feel like I start losing control of the meeting. And so I'm trying to answer for myself these 7 questions in the first 30 to 60 seconds. And I mean, I don't want to make this sound egotistical, but that's where experience comes into play. If you're going to be in a high-stakes, controversial, emotional meeting, I'm asking myself, can I figure out what the motivation for the disruption is? Is it spontaneous or orchestrated? Are they trying to redirect the format and or content? Or are they simply trying to shut the meeting down? Is it coming from people who are, as you mentioned in your example, representative of a large segment of the audience, or is it just 1 or 2 people? What were my objectives for the meeting? So, what form of adaptation will still work and still meet our objectives? And in terms of deciding whether or not it might be time to shut down the meeting, do I have more to gain or lose by continuing the meeting or ending it? So these are the questions that are going on inside my head as a facilitator in very rapid fashion while that disruption is occurring. And based upon what I divine or the best answers to those questions I can, in the first 30 to 60 seconds, I'm going to try different things that might work. So let me talk about what might work, because you used the word adaptation. So this is the old version. Somehow it made it in there. The new version of this now goes from stay the course to adapt, and then from adapt to either give in or withdraw. So I've got the lines drawn differently because after presenting this a couple of times, I realized that really adaptation is the first response other than staying the course. So let me talk about what I mean by that and what some of the strategies are. Stay the course obviously is we find some way, like you suggest, that by letting people know there's an alternative way to meet their needs, that they can get their needs taken and we can stay the course and have exactly the content and format that we intended. So what do I offer up when I'm in that situation? And I believe it's possible based upon the answers to those 7 rapid fire questions. If I believe that it's possible in that situation to stay the course, I may use, for example, in Ann's case, the regulatory legal context. So when someone disrupts a public hearing, what I emphasize is that we're required to hold a meeting. We need to get comments on the record. We have a court reporter or whatever there. They can't hear or get the comments if there are disruptions. I need it to be quiet. And this will be their only opportunity to make these comments orally. So if they disrupt the meeting, they will lose that opportunity. So I use the regulatory legal context in something like that. In another meeting where it's not required, I'm not going to be able to use that. So again, it depends upon the type of meeting, what rationales you may be able to use for staying the course. But that one works very well, frankly, in a regulatory context. Another one that has universal appeal is simply saying that out of fairness to those who came for the advertised purpose or agenda, it would be unfair to completely change the course of the meeting and talk about different things, given that the vast majority of the people showed up to talk about that. Assuming that that's what the vast majority of people showed up. If in fact the people who came for the advertised agenda are in the distinct minority, that rationale won't work. So you begin to realize why the answers to the questions determine which ones of these rationales are likely to hold sway with the people who are disrupting. I also mentioned that if the meeting is disrupted or can't go on, it'll be a lost opportunity for them to provide input. So if they care about that, being able to provide input, that might be a reason. What I do in a public hearing situation is I train usually there's a group of people who represent the panel who's listening. And if somebody won't yield the mic or there's a disruption, I call several times for them to yield the mic or the disruption to end. If it doesn't, then I never remove people physically. I never have a sergeant of arms or police or whatever. I simply instruct the court reporter to stop recording and instruct the panel to leave the room and to, basically, so we stop the meeting, we recess temporarily. And in the interim, they get the notion that we're not going to simply carry on in the face of disruption, that if they want to have a hearing, if they want their opportunity to provide input, then we have to have decorum according to the rules that I've set out as a public hearing moderator. That's never failed to work. I've fortunately only had to use it maybe a dozen times in the last 28 years, but it's never failed to work that by taking that recess and turning off the court reporter and having the hearing panel leave, that we haven't been able to restore order and go on with the rest of the meeting without any kind of disruption. So the format is going to provide different opportunities for what will be an appropriate rationale for staying the course. Again, if the majority of people are there for the advertised purpose, then I can sometimes do a straw poll and say, how many people would like to continue with this? And if I get a gigantic majority, then I've got a certain democratic value working for me. But if I know they're not in the majority, I'm not going to ask for the straw poll. So you can see it's it's a little bit of a cat and mouse game in situations like this. Another rationale that I use is I understand and I validate the people's issue or concern or whatever it might be. This can work with just a single person maybe who's going off topic and just simply saying, I understand you have this concern or this issue. We don't have the right people here to address that. We came for this particular topic. So while I'd like to be able to address that, there's no one here who can address that because we didn't come prepared for that. That actually works pretty well a lot of the time for staying the course. And then I think where it comes up, what was referred to earlier, is other options or means to meet the disruptors' objectives are available. So if you've got to say, hey, but here's a hearing where it will be addressed, or here's a meeting where we will discuss it, or here's somebody that you can contact, this is their, if you can give them a legitimate way of meeting their needs, that doesn't mean you having to completely throw out the agenda for your meeting, then that will work. So those are some of the rationales that I've used successfully to help a meeting stay on course when a group of people or an individual are trying to take us a different direction. So any questions or comments? Can we open it up again? Any questions about that?
Ann Harding has her hand up.
Okay.
Hi, Louis. It's Anne from Canada.
Hi.
And hi. You mentioned that you may validate someone's concern and as a way to stay the course and just say that the person isn't there to address that. And I wonder if you can talk a bit about the line between validating concerns and empathizing with the folks who are causing the upright. So is there a line that needs to be walked there, and how do you judge taking sides, I guess?
Well, it's different for me as a neutral facilitator than it might be for you as somebody representing the decision maker.
Yep. So
in the case of a decision maker, they probably, if they disagree with what's being said, you're absolutely right. They probably don't want to validate it in that sense, and would rather say, I can empathize with your concern. As a neutral facilitator, I'm in a slightly different position, because what I can say is something along the lines that I understand that, and it's more perhaps along the lines of empathizing. I understand this is important to you. I understand that this is a topic that is, has great concern. I can acknowledge what they're feeling or what they're thinking. I don't agree with them in the sense I say, oh yeah, that's a big problem. So it's not validating in that sense. So I don't mean necessarily agreeing or disagreeing, simply validating in the sense that they have a legitimate, cause for wanting to have this discussion about this topic, whatever that might be. So you're right, I avoid saying they're right or wrong. I simply acknowledge that it's something that's worth having more discussion about, just not here and now. Does that make sense?
Great. Yep. Thanks.
Yeah. Another question?
Thanks, Ann. Yeah, Sandy Harbacher's here from National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation. Sandy.
Hey, Sandy.
Yeah, hi Louis. Hi Larry. Yeah, I just wanted to ask Louis if he feels that organized disruptions are increasing in number or increasing in intensity or in the amount of just organization that's going into them, and why that might be. To tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I would say that the amount of organized disruptions are maybe slightly increased, but it would be anecdotal at best. I've been dealing with organized and disorganized disruptions since the first meeting I started, literally the first meeting I moderated. So it's nothing new from that standpoint. What's new in the U.S., and I would say U.S. only, is that disruptors are now being trained by billionaires providing money to them and how to disrupt meetings.
Right.
And so they're orchestrated, and some are orchestrated, organized at a level far greater than what we've seen before. So that is a different phenomenon. I know some of the dispute resolution and universities in the U.S. Have taken up the cause to study that phenomenon in greater depth. It'll be very interesting to see what they find out. But I had an interesting exchange with someone over one of these types of disruptions, in which they said, we're just taking a page from Saul Alinsky.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with the book?
Yeah, yeah.
Help me out, the title escapes me at the moment.
Oh.
Rules for Radicals, I think is what it's called.
Right, right.
And so it was this Tea Party person saying, hey, we're just getting even for the 60s. It's basically what they were saying. And we're just taking a page out of their book. And so it reminded me this stuff has been around for as long as I've practically been alive. So no, in that sense, I don't think it's new. I think it's being applied and organized and orchestrated in a kind of an unprecedented way. That would be my answer. And I think it'll be very interesting. I can't remember, I think it's the U.S. Institute for Environmental Conflict Resolution and a couple of the universities actually have started a research project to look at that phenomenon. We should keep an eye on it. I know it just got started, so I don't think they have any results yet.
Right. And Louis, I wondered if there were other resources out there that people could tap into. I know that study that you mentioned is just beginning, so is there anything
if you go online, I've done some online research to try and see what do you do. When I was faced with the first anti-Agenda 21 situation, became aware of it, started going online. And frankly, there are some good things out there to deal with what I'll call spontaneous disruptions, the garden variety that we're all kind of used to. I haven't seen anything very good for dealing with the really orchestrated and planned disruptions, and particularly when the purpose of the disruption is not to redirect the meeting, but is to literally just shut it down. I don't think anybody's got a handle on what to do. In fact, all it takes is, frankly, 7 or 8 or fairly well-organized individuals who can pretty much shut down a meeting these days unless you're willing to physically remove them if they know what they're doing. So,
Sandy, thanks a lot.
Yeah, sure. Let's move on to the next one if we can, or else we won't get through this in an hour. So I'm going to go to the rationales for adapting. And this is one of those areas where, I mentioned that there are both opportunities and challenges. And there are some real opportunities in adapting. Obviously, if we can address relevant stakeholder concerns and to find a way to fold them in. So sometimes it's as simple as we're breaking into small groups, and they say, no, we don't want to break into small groups. We want to stay in our big groups. We want to talk about X. And I've created on the fly a different small group to talk about their topic, and we've grabbed another facilitator or reassigned another small group facilitator. We basically said, great, that's what you guys want to talk about. Let's add that topic, and let's make that a part of it. And they were fine with that, all right? Another rationale for adapting is to be responsive to community preferences. So, sorry, Larry, you're doing your Darth Vader thing again.
Sorry about that, Louis.
Yeah, okay. So, for example, I was at a public meeting for an EIS in Hawaii. See what it was. He was a captain, had just turned it over to me to moderate the meeting, and several Hawaiians stood up and said, we're offended that you didn't open this meeting with a Hawaiian prayer. And I said, well, we certainly don't want to offend anyone. I said, give me a minute to confer with the captain. I went over to confer with the captain. I said, I don't have a problem. Do you have a problem? He says, no. So I went back and said, Pastor Patterson, we would be honored to have you offer us a prayer if you would. And he was slightly surprised. He really thought it was going to be, a way of kind of like disrupting the meeting. But he was sincere. He just wanted to start it. So he offered this beautiful prayer. We didn't worry about separation of church and state. We just went with it. And he asked for people to listen carefully to each other and be Pacific and aloha and all this other stuff. It was a beautiful beginning to the meeting, and I think it really helped the whole tone of the meeting because he was sincere. So by being responsive to that community preference, frankly, the decision maker gained a lot of brownie points for doing that. So there's opportunities in adapting as well, but we still got to hold the meeting that we intended to hold. If you have as a decision maker, have a reputation for being inflexible, then occasionally showing flexibility can, again, win you some relationship points. It is oftentimes possible to accommodate multiple objectives. In terms of, let's say they've got, again, petitions they want signed, or they've got literature they want to hand out, or whatever it might be. Find a way for them to set up and do what they want to do in a way that doesn't interfere with you achieving your objectives, and everybody goes home happy. So we've made many of those on-the-fly adaptations and again, and it's appreciated, most of the time it's appreciated by the stakeholders that you did that. And the other reason for adapting is because it's become painfully obvious that you are not going to hold the meeting you intended to hold for whatever reason. And at least by adapting, you can salvage what's possible. So maybe you don't get exactly the types of comments you wanted. Maybe you don't get exactly the content covered that you wanted, but you get a good swatch of it, and you complete, your primary objective of having gone out and gathered input, let's say if that's what your objective was, from the public. So frankly, adaptation happens, I wouldn't say often, but it happens frequently enough to be a very viable response when there are disruptions. And it's a whole lot better than the next two I'm going to talk about. So Larry, can we open it up again and see if anybody has any questions or comments about adaptation?
Sure. I can do so. Looking for hands. There was an interesting comment made in between commenters earlier that it would be interesting to think more about the difference between advocates and disruptors, and from whose perspective. I think.
You know what? Actually, let's talk about that. I just saw something recently where one of the more right-wing members of the U.S. Senate had some nice things to say about Nelson Mandela, and he was accused by people of a certain persuasion of selling out because obviously Nelson Mandela was a terrorist. So, clearly we all have different views of the world, and one person's disruptor is another person's advocate. I try not to, my approach to disruptions is totally pragmatic. I'm not making value judgments on my part. I'm simply trying to accomplish the most of what can be accomplished. I'm going to go ahead for just a second to one of the later ones, this one. For me, the critical issue is fairness. And I'm trying to account for three groups: those who are initiating the disruption, the other participants who came expecting the meeting that we advertised, and the decision maker and or convening entity. So all three of those people have needs. What's happening usually, though, is only the disruptors are expressing their needs. And they are essentially, they can become the whole conversation between me as a facilitator and them as the disruptors. And so I look for ways to get the other two stakeholder groups involved in what we're going to do in that meeting. So for example, doing something like calling for a straw poll. People might be intimidated by the disruptors, but they'd be willing to raise their hand. Or I was at a meeting recently where somebody came in late, didn't hear the announcement, didn't know what the meeting was really about, didn't know what the format was, and started kind of single-handedly taking me on and occupying all of my time. So, at some point I have to disrupt that tea party that we're in and say, are there other people who feel similarly, or do something to, change the focus so it's not just between me and the disruptor? And one woman said, well, I kind of thought we came, she was an elderly woman, she had a lot of grudginess in that room. She said, well, I kind of thought we came here to do X, Y, Z, which was what we'd announced at the beginning of the meeting. And it changed the whole tenor of the meeting of people going, yeah, I thought that's what we came here to do, yeah. And next thing you know, he blinked, he sat down, and we went on with the meeting that we intended to have. So I'm trying to make sure that everybody is weighing in if possible. And I'm trying to find some way that the disruptors / advocates get their needs met, how the other participants who came for the advertised purpose give it, and obviously that the person who's probably paying me gets their meeting and public participation objectives met. So it's not a value judgment on my point about whether they're disruptor. Look at the definition. It's a valueless judgment on my part of what a disruption is. A disruption is simply someone who's trying to steer the meeting in a different way. And as a facilitator, my job is to decide, should we stay the course? Can we stay the course? And if we can't stay the course, and it's okay for us to vary from the course, what's the best path from there? So let me go back to rationales for adapting. So we talked about that. All right. So what are the rationales for just, I'm going to say, giving in? Well, first of all, staying the course and adapting didn't work. You're still, despite your best attempts at staying the course or adapting, the disruption is still going on, and so that's one reason to give in and basically say, I have no way of forcing people to participate in the meeting I intended. I never touch people. I never remove them. It's just what I do try to do is make clear to everyone in the room what's happening, and that I oftentimes apologize to the people who came there for the intended purpose. I may mention that I'm powerless to do anything to stop the disruption because, and so it looks like we're going to have the meeting that these people want to have. Then the question is, do you stay or not? All right, because sometimes they can have their meeting, but you don't need to be there because basically it turns out you're irrelevant to their meeting. If what they're trying to do is to force you to stay and listen to what they want you to say, hear them say in the way they want to say it, and in a sense almost make you hostage to their meeting, then it's a different situation. But you know, the rationales for giving in, because you don't really have any other choice. You have no way of forcing the meeting that you want to have, and maybe your objectives, among your objectives for that meeting or for your public participation, have to do with making sure people feel heard. And I know people who have, I've never done this myself because I've never given in, should I say. But I know other people who've given in and said, all right, we'll have your meeting about your topic and the way you want to have it. And they've sat there and usually been harangued for a couple of hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, and yet they still walked away saying, I'm glad I did that. That was worth it. People felt heard, and they got their needs met, and at the end of the day, I can say that I was there, and I listened, and I got their feedback, and that was worth it to me, even though we didn't talk about the issues that I wanted to talk about. So I want to go to the next one, and then we'll pretty much open this up. So that's rationales for giving in. Rationales for withdrawing, and by that I mean literally you leave. Because you realize nothing constructive is going to happen by continuing. It's just going to be really unpleasant for everybody, and oftentimes the people I'm most worried about, frankly, are the other participants who showed up expecting a different meeting. And if I stay, they kind of feel, by I mean the convening authority, if we stay, then they feel like, well, I guess this is the meeting. I guess we need to stick around. But if they see that we're saying, you know what, have at it, have fun, but I would say it this way, obviously, but we're going to withdraw, then the other people who also had no intention of being there for that meeting that's essentially taken over also realize the meeting's over, if for all intents and purposes, and if they don't choose to participate any longer, they feel free to leave as well. Another reason for withdrawing is that you have concerns about your personal safety. I've had several situations over the years where it's gotten close and we've had sincere concerns about our personal safety, and we've been able to reassure ourselves that we were not literally at physical risk. Sometimes during a meeting, I've had to warn people who were making veiled threats that they needed to cease and desist, and if they didn't, we would be calling law enforcement if they made a credible threat and ending the meeting, and they immediately stopped that behavior because they realized they that was a spontaneous thing where they just kind of got caught up in themselves and their emotions ran away with them. So fine, they realized and they tamped it back down and we went on with the meeting. Or for whatever reason, it simply appears that withdrawing appears to be a better option, then essentially what's going to happen is losing control of the meeting. I don't know what it is about my character, my personality, but you know, I'll adapt, negotiate, accommodate with the best of them, but the last thing I seem to be willing to put up with is losing control of the meeting. So I'd rather withdraw than appear to have lost control of the meeting, and that may be just me. So now we've covered probably some more controversial strategies in the last two slides. Why don't we open it up again, Larry? See if people have questions or comments.
Well, and from my perspective, Louis, I think it's good to explore the possibility that withdrawal becomes necessary, because there could be times when that arises, and no, it might not be the most popular thing for us to do, but safety is important, and in the earlier slide you were talking about the broader public engagement process that a person is trying to execute, that it's more than just this one meeting, and so I think there's a need to balance the concerns about the meeting at hand where there's a disruption and the process as a whole, which might stretch on for more weeks or months or even years.
Yeah.
So.
Well, what's interesting is, and going back to I think it was Sandy's question about are we seeing more of it, in a way, there's this positive negative reinforcement. If we continue to give positive reinforcement by allowing those kinds of mean-spirited disruptions to happen and continue to sit there while they happen, I won't mention what particular city it is in Northern California, but I've been working with the planning and transit department of a metropolitan area up in Northern California, where in fact it has kind of become state of the practice that they hold meetings and people get up there and just harangue them and say nasty, irresponsible, semi-threatening things, and they just sit there and listen to it, and that passes for civil discourse in this town for the most part. And when I suggested during the training that they could always withdraw, they just looked at me like, well, no, we can't. I mean, they literally couldn't believe that it was possible to withdraw, and I said, why not? And they couldn't come up with a reason why not. They just assumed that as government officials, it was their job to take whatever kind of abuse citizens were capable of handing out, and I don't believe that's the case.
Well, and in addition, you talked about format and the influence that format can have on the ability that you might have to counteract disruptions. I think there are plenty of cities and other public agencies who don't realize that there's another paradigm for how to format the meeting that might lead to fewer disruptions. Steve Buckley had a comment, has his hand up. Steve, you there? Steve Buckley?
Here.
Go ahead.
I'm wondering if IAP2, for example, have a nice graphic that would show, say, this is where we are in the process at this meeting, like you are here, or we are here, so that you could say, first is informational session, next week we'll talk about various alternative possible solutions or alternatives, and then there'll be a third where it comes together, but something that can explain before people get up, where they might say, oh, in their head, oh, that's next week. Okay, well, I guess I'll stick around for the Q&A, or
actually, I would say,
go ahead.
I would say we always do that. I mean, I don't start any meeting without telling people where it fits into the whole process, what the opportunity is at this particular meeting, and what opportunities there will be at future meetings. I just consider that part of my job as a facilitator. But if you go back to the questions that I said that we posed, the 6 questions, whether or not that will work depends upon the answers to these 6 questions. If in fact the person is just so highly energized and motivated to talk about a particular topic, they simply may not be capable of deferring to a future time. It's just they're there that night or that day, they came to talk about that, and all of my entreaties to them to sublimate and move to some other place or time to talk about simply may get me nowhere, okay? Or it may. So you got to decide, it's worth a try, but it may not work. You may have said all of that, or what happened to me in the meeting, I mentioned where the guy was kind of going one-on-one. The problem was he just walked straight into the room and started saying stuff. He didn't hear the introduction, he didn't hear my explanation, he didn't pick up any handouts. So, so you got to deal with what's in the room.
Lewis, let me see if I can get Richard Delaney into the conversation. He posed a written question. Richard, are you there? Do you have a microphone?
Hey, Richard.
I don't know whether Richard, he typed his question, so I don't know whether he's able to use a
Can you
mic.
read
So
it? Can you read it out?
I'll read it out. He asked about intimidation and what might happen when a group of people show up and start handing out ball caps or scarves to demonstrate their position. So this gets back to that original poll question, which I'll put up on the screen here, where you might have, instead of it being verbal, some sort of nonverbal, holding up of signs or passing out bumper stickers or something like that. So I guess Richard was just asking whether you have thoughts on managing that kind of.
Yeah. I mean, that's an example. So let's talk about the subject of intimidation. It's a good one. I've moderated hearings with 1,000 people where 600 of them had the "We're Against It" T-shirts and 400 of them had the "We're For It" T-shirts. Honestly, and there was all kinds of shenanigans going on outside the meeting room, and we had probably 8 or 10 police there in case a riot broke out. So these things happen. I feel like my job as a facilitator is to maintain a safe environment where anyone, regardless of their opinion or what they have to offer, has the opportunity to do that. And so, yes, intimidation is a real thing, and I'm going to do everything in my power. So, for example, I might try requesting that people not bring in certain things into the room. We say it's fine if you want to wear buttons or that, but for safety purposes, we're not allowing any large objects, signs, sticks, or whatever. And some people, you'd be amazing. 9 times out of 10, they'll respect that. They'll go set them down. In fact, I'll even say, hey, you know what? I've got an area over here where you can put them. You're free to pick them up when the meeting's over and take them. Again, it's not like I'm being mean or I'm judging them. I'm simply saying, excuse me, I got a cold. I'm trying to get through this. I'm simply saying that doesn't work for this meeting for everyone, right? That's not fair to everyone. And we want to keep this a safe and not an environment where no one feels intimidated. At the beginning of a meeting or hearing, if I think there's a lot of that going on, I may actually say something to that very effect, which say, the most important thing here is that everyone has an equal chance to participate and feels free to do that and doesn't feel intimidated. So let's say it's a public hearing, and the first time somebody says something that somebody doesn't like or group doesn't like, they start booing or hissing. I immediately ask that person to stop speaking. I tell the court reporter to stop recording. I turn to the audience and say, it's really important that everyone feel free to speak their minds. We knew coming in here tonight that people have different points of view, and we need to accept that people are going to say things that you don't like. All I ask is that you don't catcall or boo or hiss or whatever while someone's speaking, so that they don't feel intimidated from doing that. And again, if you just explain to people that you're trying to do it out of fairness to protect people's, in the U.S. First Amendment rights to, free speech, whatever, and which kind of goes back to my last slide, which I'm going to go back down to, which is.
And then, Lewis, I do have a hand when you have a chance to.
You bet. I'm trying to lead everyone to higher ground. I'm trying to appeal to fairness and societal values and find the best outcome for everybody. But obviously, intimidation is not a good outcome for anyone, unless, in fact, they're sincere about their intimidation, in which case I'm probably not going to stop them anyway. But, I'm always trying to appeal to fairness and higher societal values and why we're going to do what we're going to do, and appeal to people's better instincts. And the vast majority of the time, it works.
Susan, I don't know how to pronounce your last name, Frag or Frag, has her hand raised. Susan, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yes, I'm Susan Frag. I'm from Winnipeg, and my consulting practice involves community planning and public engagement. And my question to you, Lewis, is whether you find that this issue of meeting disruption is more frequent with hearings, panels, one-offs, so to speak, as opposed to situations where you're working with, let's say, an advisory committee on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, I
Where
would
there's
say,
an opportunity to build relationships.
well, there's a lot in between those two. So I would say the answer to your question is yes. Advisory committees tend not to attract a lot of that. But if you look at the rest of the range of what I'll call public meetings, and I don't know whether maybe one-offs, but even if it's a series of workshops, let's say, and it's at a particular phase of a planning process, there's a lot of disruptions that occur even in those situations. It doesn't have to be just a public hearing. I do think that there's a theatrical aspect to a public hearing that probably invites theatrical behavior, and people understand that there's not going to be a lot of opportunity for dialogue, if you will, when they're being given 3 minutes to speak. And so in order to make themselves heard or noticed or to get media attention or whatever, yeah, a thing like a public hearing is more likely. And also because public hearings are kind of set up in a kind of adversarial fashion. So if you've got, I think Larry mentioned this earlier, and maybe Larry anyway, that there are different formats. Formats help a lot. So the choice of format can do a lot to disarm or lessen the chances. But I would pretty much say, regardless, that if an individual or group of individuals feel very strongly about something and are afraid of the outcome of your meeting, rightly or wrongly, either because they do or don't understand what its purpose is, or where it fits in the decision-making process or anything else, if they feel like their best way to pursue their interests is to stop the process and make their voices heard, then they'll disrupt any kind of meeting. I think you should be always prepared that it could happen, just about anywhere.
Louis, Ann Harding had a quick comment to add to what you were saying a little while ago. Ann?
Thanks, Larry. And I guess this is sort of a more broad principled kind of question here, is asking if we're, it prompted me in your last slide talking about, your worst thing is to lose control of a meeting. And I'm wondering if we're working under the assumption here that disruptions are necessarily a bad thing. I'm thinking about the disruptions that I've faced, and often it is, what you just referenced, is people who feel passionately about something that's important to them and that they can't feel heard in some way. And so I just wonder if we're talking about, just trying to temper that and control that and keep control, or if there are ways that we can not necessarily embrace it, but rather than trying to keep control, have the focus be for them to feel heard.
Well, I understand your question. I think it's a good comment. I think I may mean something different by control. What's interesting is it's kind of like the focus on the kid who's having the tantrum, and I don't mean to compare disruptors, but what happens in a lot of families is some kids get a lot of attention and some kids don't get attention. And so I'm trying to represent the interest, as I said, of 3 different stakeholder groups. Those who are initiating the disruption, again, I'm using that in a non-pejorative sense. The other participants who are not participating in the disruption, and the objectives of the decision maker who held this meeting in the first place. And so by control, what I mean is that I am still in a position to help direct a meeting in the most productive manner possible. All right? That's what I believe I get paid to do. I get paid to help people make good use of their time. And in the case of public participation, to help them get heard. So no, by control, I don't mean shut them down, but I mean still be people. Whether people still expect me as a facilitator, and I'm speaking the role of facilitator, to maintain control in the sense that keep making conscious choices about how we are going to proceed. And as long as those conscious choices that we're making, instead of just saying, I don't know what we should do here. Do whatever you want. That's what I mean by loss of control. I'm not doing my job as a facilitator if I do that. What I'm trying to do is have some sort of détente, negotiation, accommodation, adaptation, something with the people who are trying to redirect the meeting in a way that helps them get their needs met if they're legitimate, and also all the other people who aren't participating in the disruption, including the other participants and decision makers. What I meant by the word legitimate is if somebody's job is simply to stop the meeting, that's not really an advocate wanting to be heard. That's somebody trying to actually deny others their ability to be heard. That's where I draw the line.
Oh, it is interesting to try to parse the two. I mean, it can be hard, I think, especially in the 30 to 60 seconds that you described, Louis, where you have to assess the situation to be sure of what the person's motives may be. But so I think Anne's bringing up an interesting
I'm glad you mentioned that. It's in the first 30 or 60 seconds that I decide what strategy out of all the strategies I discussed I'm going to use. That doesn't mean the disruption's over in 60 seconds. It means I'm going to pick what I think is my best strategy in that situation, whether it's stay the course, adapt, whatever it might be. But then there's going to be a response to whatever my intervention was, right? I'll get more information from that response on answering those 7 questions. So when I'm going back and forth with the disruption, I'm gaining, each time I get a reaction from them, I'm gaining more information, both verbal and nonverbal, on what the nature of their motivation is and what their likely response is going to be to my next intervention so that I can choose my second one. So, you know, there may be 10, 12, 15 exchanges that go on before we finally figure out what we're actually going to do.
Sure. Let me squeeze in, I think, one more question or comment from a guy named Scott Henriksen. Scott, are you there?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Michaelson, I very much have enjoyed your comments. You said that you have never, or I believe you said that you have never had anyone removed from a meeting. And my question is that because you have withdrawn from the meeting rather than have them removed? And if not, then what has been your most successful tool for extremely disruptive individuals or groups, short of withdrawing from the meeting?
Well, it depends upon the format. Most often when that has happened, it's been in a public hearing situation. And as I said, I find a recess. It's nice to have a recess because it means I haven't actually stopped the meeting and left, but I've sent a clear message that we're not going to continue in that vein unless the disruption stops. So that has been an incredibly effective technique. It's never failed to work. I do want to give you one example of where it didn't work, and it was because I was in Hawaii, and the gentleman who was not yielding the microphone and was going on happened to be an elderly Hawaiian. And when I asked the panel to leave the room temporarily, we all got up and left except for one of the panel members. And I'm looking back at him wondering why he didn't leave. And then, unfortunately, it hit me within 5 seconds. Culturally, he was Hawaiian himself, and culturally, he could not bring himself to be disrespectful to this other elderly Hawaiian and leave while he was talking. And so the guy kept talking and talking. So as long as he sat there, this guy was going to talk. And so we're kind of sitting there, well, I don't know what to do now. I've never been in this situation before. A policeman took it upon himself to grab this guy and haul him off haul him off from the lectern. And guess what? First of all, the guy on the panel felt terrible about it because he realized it was his fault, that we had a plan and it would have worked if he'd done it. Second of all, that's what ends up being the newspaper the next day. Instead of the newspaper being disruptors shut down meeting, the story in the newspaper is, freedom fighters hauled off of stage, by force. So I just don't want to be in a position of being the one who's using force. I think I'm on higher moral ground by saying, I wish we could have continued this meeting, but it appears we can't, and I'm sorry you lost your opportunity. All of you in this room lost your opportunity for making public comment. You can still make written comments. We'll still consider all the input we received. thank you very much, and have a nice day. I'd just rather do that.
No one right answer, no one size fits all, but really am impressed with the wide array of tools that you and strategies that you rely upon. Looks like you've got one other thing to show us.
I didn't know. So specifically in response to that and a couple other questions we had, if there's disruption going on that has a lot of emotion or hostility, which is usually the ones that are most difficult to deal with, this is a tried and true approach for helping people to calm down so that in fact you can have some sort of civil discourse with them, solve problems, listen to them, have dialogue, whatever. I teach this to everyone who's involved in public hearings and open houses and public meetings so that they understand that if they're dealing with some sort of hostile or emotional reaction, and this comes down to, again, whether it's spontaneous or orchestrated. So you allow for venting, you acknowledge their feelings, you demonstrate empathy, and you verify your understanding that that's why they're feeling what they're feeling. And if they calm down, then we can usually proceed. They do calm down, we move on, provide information and develop solutions, whatever that might be. If they don't calm down, I try again, and I'm willing to go through that cycle 3 times. If at the end of 3 attempts to allow for venting, acknowledge feelings, demonstrate empathy, and verify understanding, they're still not calmed down, it's either because for whatever chemical, biological reason they're incapable of calming down at that moment, or it's because they don't actually want to calm down, they want to disrupt. It's not spontaneous on their part, it's calculated on their part, in which case nothing you're going to do is going to make any difference, and you may be in a situation of giving in or withdrawing. So there are ways of dealing with people who are concerned or upset or whatever, to empathize with them and to find out whether it's actually possible to have a meaningful exchange with them. But if there's not an opportunity to have a meaningful exchange and they're simply going to maintain this level of emotion or hostility, then you got to know when to cut your losses.
Lewis, or as I like to call him, and as others like to call him, Moose, thank you very much for such an incredible array of techniques and strategies that we can use in these challenging situations. And thanks as always for what you give to IAP2 and to IAP2 USA and Canada today. I also want to thank Francesca Petricolo, who I believe was the member that suggested this topic that other members responded to on our crowdsourcing page a few weeks ago, and I thought it was obviously a great topic, and I'm glad others felt the same way and made this webinar possible today. We had terrific attendance and great participation. Before we go, I wanted to share a quick word from Canada, and I think this applies to the United States as well, that they're looking for input on our Core Values Awards program. For those who don't know, we give awards every year, typically for Project of the Year, Organization of the Year, and often Research of the Year in our field of public participation and how it aligns with core values. So IAP2 Canada is currently seeking input on what award categories they should have, the judging criteria, and how they should recognize the best public engagement in Canada. Input is being sought until January 31st. You can go to iap2canada.ca/core value awards. That's iap2canada.ca. I'm trying to type as I talk, /core values awards. No typos, I hope. And IAP2 USA, I know, is interested in that as well. We don't have a site set up for it. The time is about to run out. Thanks to Drew helping to run this webinar. Thanks to Lewis. Thanks to all of you. Drew, thank you very much.
And thank you, Larry, for handling the moderation on that. Just want to remind you, we will have this webinar available for you through the IAP2 Canada and IAP2 USA websites within 48 hours. And don't forget that coming up in January, we've got Retrospective and Hope, the title for that. So watch the respective websites for more details on what exactly that all is going to include. So for IAP2 Canada, IAP2 USA, Merry Christmas to all, Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Holidays to all, and look forward to talking to you again real soon.